In the building soil module, what we're looking at is getting an understanding about what the composition of soil is and the processes responsible for creation of soil, and how in our production systems we can design them in a way that helps build the soil. Earlier when we were looking at global warming, we were talking about how if we can draw the carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere through photosynthesis from plants and store it in the soil, we can help reverse the impact of global warming. So it's that'll be part of the thought behind what we go through is really harnessing or understanding soil, the processes that go in it, and how we can harness those processes to build soil, increase the fertility of that soil, the production output of that soil, and have beneficial side impacts such as reversing global warming as a result of our production. So we can grow healthy soil, healthy crops, and reverse global warming all in one go. So it's a great topic to understand, and it's often said that the most important resource any society has is its soil. And if you can really look after that resource and make sure your activities are designed in a way that supports the production of healthy soil, you're really looking after the future of that society and making an investment, I guess, in what you're doing that is going to be of benefit to future generations, so that they can inherit a landscape that's productive and resilient and sustainable, which is what we should all aspire to create. So there's a few things to go through with understanding soil and the parts to building soil. The first one really is the compositional soil. So if you look at soil in a healthy soil, what should it be composed of? And then taking the main ideas of the physical structure of soil, which is the substrates of soil, and what are the properties of that. So what are the physical, chemical and biological properties of that, and what understanding do we need for each one to help build and construct healthy soil, and how does that tie in with the design of our systems. So the first thing really is the composition of soil. So in a healthy soil, about 50% of the soil is substrates. So that means ideally that these substrates are aggregated, which are just clumps, and those aggregates are created by the biological sticky substances from worms and mites and arthropods and all these different living things, and the excretions and waste products in the soil. They're sticky, and they bind together the substrates into aggregates. So aggregated clumps creates lots of spaces in the soil. So really the way to achieve this ideal soil composition is by having a rich biology in that soil that will create all those sticky glues that will aggregate the soil into these clumps or these aggregates, and that will allow 25% of the space of that soil to be occupied by water and air. And they're all very dependent upon the biological system. So without that biological system and all the carbon that they put into the soil, the soil will lose its water holding capacity. So without that carbon in the soil will lose its ability to store water like a sponge. It will just flow through the soil quite quickly, or run off the surface of soil, depending on the physical properties of the soil. But yeah, in the ideal situation, 25% of the space of the soil is water, and that water is really essential because plants need it, all living things need water, so it really sustains the life in the soil as that water that's in the soil. The air that's in the soil will allow the water to flow through the soil so that it doesn't pool and stagnate in the soil, which will block out the oxygen, and will allow the gases to circulate through the soil, and those gases will support respiration. So respiration is when living things like plants or you and I breathe in oxygen, and we use that oxygen to break down the food that we absorb to release the energy that's in it. So it's not respiration as in breathing, but it's respiration as in making use of the gases that we breathe in to break down food to release the energy. So all living things need to do it. All living things need to break down food to release energy, and we use those energies, that energy to support our biological processes. And for the organisms that are in the soil, the ideal environment is 25% of the space of the soil to be air, and the only way you get the air and the water being close to 25% is by the substrates being aggregated by the sticky glues from biological organisms, and that allows that structure, that ideal structure for the soil composition. So if we take that one step further and we really break down the soil into the physical, biological and chemical properties, that helps guide us in how we can create the most ideal circumstances within that soil that will support the building of the soil and the supply of nutrients in that soil, which will allow for good plant growth and therefore the production of resources to get from that system. So the physical properties of soil is, to understand the physical properties of the soil is to understand the composition of sand, silt, gravel and clay that are in your soil. And depending on the various compositions of each one will determine the characteristics of that soil. So for example, if your soil has got a lot of clay in it, it's going to hold on to a lot of minerals, so it's going to be a mineral-rich soil. But because clay is so fine, it will form such a compact layer of soil that it won't allow for good water or air circulation. So it won't create a soil composition which will be favourable for growing things. So ideally what we're trying to create in whatever composition of soil we have is to create this recreate this ideal soil composition, which we call a loam soil. So a loam soil is a term for it has a nice composition, so it has a good balance of sand, silt and clay. So I'll go through the others. So a clay is good for holding on to minerals, but it's so fine that it creates a very compacted soil, so it doesn't allow good water and air circulation. So ideally, to create a good loam soil, you want to balance the amount of clay that's in your soil with sand, silt and gravel. And there's lots of different ways to achieve a loam soil. So you might have a good balance of clay and silt, and if there's say 60% silt and 40% clay, that's one way to create a loam, and that would be a silty loam soil. And that creates a nice balance of soil size between the clay and the silt, which will allow for fairly good water and air circulation if you develop a good level of biology in that soil that will open up, which will form aggregates and help open up the structure of that to allow more water and air to circulate. But if it's just clay soil, pretty hard to work with just clay soil because it's so compact. You can get life going in it, and that will open it up, but it will be pretty hard to achieve that level of composition in a purely clay soil because it's so fine and so compacted. So it wouldn't be a very good agricultural soil. It would be a lot better if it had more silt in it. Or better yet, if it had something a bit bigger, so sand or gravel. And it doesn't necessarily need to have clay in it, but having clay in the soil helps hold on to the minerals. So I guess the ideal composition would be about a third of each. So if you've got a third clay, a third silt, and a third sand, that would be your ideal composition. And if you're in a place where that is the composition of your soil, you're very lucky, and that's going to be easy to work with. And if you get the life going in your soil and form these aggregates and have the recycling of nutrients in your soil, you've got a great place to work from. And it's not necessarily what you'll inherit. It could be this great composition, but it could still be quite a barren soil. But it's providing you the building blocks to create a nice soil from, if it's not already a nice soil. But the further you deviate away from this ideal composition, it can be harder, which is, I mean, you know, you're only representing maybe 5% of all agricultural land would be this ideal composition. So most of it's not, and you can have really good agricultural production from other balances, but it just makes it a little bit harder to work with the biology to create that ideal soil composition. But there's lots of other compositions that are still good. You know, you can have clay and silt, or sand and clay, or silt and sand, and you know, roughly 50-50 composition of all of these different types will all be considered loam soils of different natures. And if you can get the biology going in that soil to create these aggregates and open it up, they can all produce really good agricultural soils. So really the take-home message here is understand the composition of your soil, so how much sand, silt and clay you've got in it, and that will help just know what you've got to work with. Really, whatever you've got, you go through the same process anyway. You've got to feed that soil with well, you've got to recreate life systems in that soil which will help sustain and build that soil. And once those life systems are built, you've got to feed them with resources to help diversify and build up the life that's in that soil. And you've got to do that in any soil, regardless of what it is. But the more ideal the composition, the easier it is to work with that soil. So that's the physical properties of soil, just understanding its composition, what you've got to work with, what challenges are ahead of you. If you've got a pure silt, a pure clay, or a pure sand soil, it's going to be hard soil to work with. Not impossible, and there are, you know, great examples out there of production systems that you can work in those soils, but they tend to be more specialized. There's only certain species of plants that will work well in those types of soils, so it limits the diversity that you have to work with. So you're working with a smaller palette, which could be a good thing. Instead of having an overwhelming diversity of all these kind of things you can work with, like in Wanganui, we can pretty much grow anything. If you've got a more limited repertoire, then it kind of limits your options, and you know what works well in this situation, and you just stick to that, and that will work well for you. But yeah, the more ideal it is, the more you can grow in that environment. So the more possibilities you have to you, and the more easily you can create this nice soil composition. So the chemical properties of soil are what nutrients and minerals are in the soil. So to sustain good plant growth, you want a good diversity and abundance of minerals and nutrients in that soil. And what we typically do is we just look at the composition of those minerals and nutrients, and we apply them in a fertilizer. So we recognize that for plants to grow well, they need these lists of minerals and nutrients. So we provide that in a fertilizer. But what we don't really appreciate is the complexity that's going on in that soil. So how those minerals and nutrients can be supplied by creating the environment within the soil for the biological system to function at its optimal rate, and to feed it the correct resources, so that those minerals and nutrient resources are being recycled and stored in that soil and made available in a plant absorbable form at a very slow rate that's just perfect for the plant's growth. And we just can't recreate that system, no matter how intelligently we provide fertility, our fertilizer management system. We just can't recreate it. So even the most perfect organically sourced biological fertilizers can't replicate how perfectly those minerals and nutrients are provided to plants through a correctly and healthy soil with all the dynamics of interactions between those living elements of the soil. But typically what we have done in the past is a lot worse than the ideal. We've created these salt-based chemical fertilizers with basically just nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium. So the old NPK. So if we look at NPK, we've got nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium. And these are considered the macronutrients. So they're some of the most important nutrients to support plant growth. They are used to build proteins, they're used to support enzyme function, they're used to promote good fruit growth and good seeding, and good reproduction, so growth of flowers. So these nutrients are really important for plants. They're called macronutrients because they're the nutrients that were required in the highest amount. So earlier on in our agricultural evolution, when we applied these fertilizers, the soils were generally a lot healthier, and they had a whole spectrum of other nutrients and minerals in those soils. And when we supplied these NPK and salt-based chemical fertilizers, the plants grew really well because these were the ones that they really needed, and there was all these other nutrients already in the soil. So these salt-based fertilizers, what happens when those salts are applied to the soil, they get absorbed in the water. So all salts can dissolve in water, so they dissolve in water. And they break down into ions. And these salts, are generally, you got your hydrogen ion, which is acidic, and then bound to that hydrogen ion, you've got various negative ions, such as your NPK and other minerals that they add to that fertilizer. So these can be absorbed by the plant, or largely they get washed away. But you get a build-up of this other part of the salts, the hydrogen ions, that acidifies the soil, so that over time, with the application of these salt-based fertilizers, the soil is acidified. And a lot of agricultural plants don't like acidic soil. Blueberries love it, but not many other plants do. So if your soil becomes too acidic, you're changing the environment in a way that a lot of your production plants don't like, and it will stress them, and they'll grow less well, and they'll be less abundant. So that's one of the problems with prolonged use of an NPK dominated fertilizer that's based on a salt, is that it will acidify your soil. The other thing is these salts are not from a natural source, so they're from synthetic sources, and when they're absorbed into the soil profile, they harm the biology that's in the soil, so they have a negative impact on the biology of the soil. So that soil that was once functioning healthily and providing these nutrients and recycling these nutrients in the soil is getting damaged by those fertilizers, and they're getting killed off, and then therefore the soil is getting poorer. So its composition it's losing that composition. It can no longer form aggregates, so it will start to get compacted. There'll be less water and air available in that soil. The storage of nutrients that biology was storing in that soil will be diminished, and with erosion and leaching of the soil. They'll get washed away. So the soil is becoming poorer in quality over time, and more reliant upon a constant input of these fertilizers, because the biological systems that were providing the fertility in that soil are getting killed off. And that means you're more reliant upon the artificial source of those nutrients through fertilizers and stuff. But the more you apply these fertilizers to it, the worse the impact on the biology on the soil, the poorer the composition of the soil, the harder it is for anything to grow in that soil, the more it gets eroded by weathering, because less things can grow in that soil, because you're providing poorer habitat for them, but also because you're tilling and eroding that soil and planting just one crop all the time. So there's all these accumulating practices that we have adopted in our past of agricultural production in the last 100 years mainly, with industrial agriculture, that diminishes, depletes and erodes the soil and makes that soil harder to sustain a healthy and sustainable food production system. So it's really our challenge in the next phase of our agricultural evolution, is to work on ways that we can provide the chemical fertility to the soil in a way that is sustainable, builds the soil, enriches the biology of the soil, and supports a complex assemblage of life on top of that soil in which we're extracting resources from. But the only way to get that is by building good soil first. So, yeah, really, we'll go through the biological properties of the soil, which is the way to really understand this well. But I guess while we're still on the topic of chemical fertilizers, there will be times where you've got a soil that's it's not in a good state, and you want to kickstart the production of that soil, and you might want to apply a fertilizer just to kind of get it to a point where you can get production off it and utilize that production in a way that will build the biology in the soil. And in that case, the sources of fertilizers that you could use would be more organic, biology-based ones. So the ideal fertilizer, so if we rub off all this NPK salt-based stuff, the ideal fertilizer would be an organically sourced natural fertilizer. Could be blood and bone, could be seaweed, could be compost tea, and that could have different recipes depending on what is available. But any of these kind of organically, naturally sourced fertilizers are a good way to introduce a source of fertility to your soil. Worm peat, another good one. And they're in a form that's not the salt-based fertilizer, so it's in a form that is going to be more beneficial to the life that's in that soil, while at the same time helping promote good, healthy plant growth. And if you couple that with biological preparation, so if you boost the amount of living and beneficial bacteria that are in it, so you give it a boost of beneficial bacteria, and you can do it with fungi as well, you're kick-starting the biology in that soil. So you're inoculating that soil with a healthy microorganism population that will help speed up the transition of that soil to become more diverse and stable and abundant in a way that will provide the nutrients to the plants more sustainably, with less effort from and less resources from the farmer, which is what you want to achieve. So the ideal situation with use of fertilizers is to get an organically sourced one. These are great sources. and to boost that fertilizer with bacteria and fungi. And a good way to do this is to create aerated preparations. So these beneficial microorganisms, they all are aerobic respirers, so they have got to respire aerobically like we do, which means they breathe in oxygen to break down food to release energy. And in a healthy soil should be dominated by aerobic respiration, because it should have 25% air, should have lots of water, should be lots of nutrients in the substrate. So it's creating an environment which favors aerobic microorganisms, because the opposite is the anaerobic ones, and they're the ones that smell terrible when they break down things. They ferment so they can digest organic matter without oxygen, but they create a condition or environment within that soil that is not very favourable, at least immediately, for production of crops from. So a good way to get this aerobic preparation with all those beneficial microorganisms is you could take, this one's probably too strong, so these are more ideal, and you probably want to dilute this one too. But if you take those and you put them in a mescaline bag or hessian bag, and you put it in a container, you could do this to a big scale still. So if you take a big bucket with lots of holes in it, and you put it in a big container that's being churned around, so that it's got water in it, and it's being stirred. So you can do this on a 1,000-gallon scale, create massive scales of fertilizer, and it's just taking a source of natural, organically sourced fertilizer, putting it into water that is being oxygenated, and inoculating that with a source of compost which will be full of the beneficial bacteria that will be good for that soil, and they will multiply in that aerobic preparation. And then you can take that preparation, and you've got to use it quickly before it stagnates and becomes anaerobic. So you've got to use it quickly, apply it to your fields, and that will apply a good organic fertilizer that's full of all these beneficial microorganisms to your soil. And that's the best way to apply a chemical preparation to your soil that will boost the minerals and nutrients to it. I guess the last thing to think about there is just what your soil might be lacking, because certain trace nutrients, if they're in small amounts in your soil, or they're not there at all, like boron or selenium are classic examples here in New Zealand, if they're not in your soil, they can be a limiting factor to plant growth. So you want to do a soil test ideally that will determine what nutrients are in a healthy soil in your area, because there may be certain areas, certain minerals that are not regionally very abundant, and you want to include those minerals specifically into your preparation to help boost up the production in that soil. And you wouldn't need much, these are just trace mineral amounts, but just the incorporation of them into your soil will boost the growth of these agricultural plants, because they have evolved in environments where those minerals are in the soil. So if they're not in your soil, they're going to not grow very well. So you want to create the optimal environment for that plant as you can. Keeping in mind, however, though, that you want to pick a plant that is best suited to your condition. So if your condition really doesn't suit a particular type of plant, you're best just growing a plant that is suited to your conditions, rather than pouring in all these resources all the time to try to change that environment to suit that plant. You're better off just growing a plant that does grow well in that situation. So that is where kind of local observation comes in, and seeing what does do well in your region, talking to farmers and getting a sense of what your conditions of your local soil are like, and what grows well in those situations. So biological properties of soil are at the heart of understanding how we can really create healthy, resilient soils which will help sustain and be at the base of a productive agricultural system. So creating that system really depends upon creating the environments within the soil that will help support good production. And at the heart of that is really understanding what's happening in the biology in that soil and working with that biology to support and grow it and diversify it and create the conditions within the biology within the soil that favours the growth of the plant. And the plant will do a lot of that work for you, which is like the great thing about this, in that a plant by nature is busy photosynthesizing, so will produce 2/3 of its sugars from photosynthesis will be used to support plant growth and reproduction and just life cycle processes, so to support plant. But the interesting thing is that through its root network, the plant is going to put 1/3 of all the sugars produced by photosynthesis into the soil to feed the microorganisms that are in that soil, and by doing that attract the microorganisms that are beneficial to the plant. So 1/3 of sugars released as exudates into the soil, and that creates a beneficial soil community to support plant growth. So this is, agricultural production has really got quite complicated as far as trying to understanding the inputs required into the soil to help support the plant growth. But the interesting thing about the system is that the tree or the plant will do this all by itself. It's putting 1/3 of all the food, initially sugars, but that will transition into proteins and lipids as the plant gets more healthy, and that will create a more diverse soil community in that soil. But the plant is creating this beneficial community within the soil that will support the production of the plant. So without the need to apply all these fertilizers and sources of nutrient to the plant is attracting those nutrients to it by creating an environment within the soil where it establishes these beneficial interactions with the microbiology in the soil, where in exchange for the exudates, so the sugars, the proteins, the fats, that it will give to those microorganisms, those microorganisms will supply minerals and nutrients to that plant from quite far and wide throughout the soil. So, fungal hyphae are amazing. So in a forest, for example, the hyphae network of fungi can extend hundreds of thousands of kilometers. So let's just say hundreds of kilometers. And the result of that is that these fungi hyphae can extract minerals from within the forest, or they generally occur in forests because they've evolved to work with trees, so you generally get them in forests or woodland environments. But they extend through that system and they extract the nutrients and they provide it to the tree or the shrub or the perennial plant in exchange for the exudates that plant is providing. So it's this amazing beneficial relationship, providing these nutrients to the plant in exchange for the exudates. So really the best thing you can do to create an environment in the soil that will be best for this plant is just to look after the growth of the plant. And initially that might be through certain inputs into the soil, just to get the system kick-started. But really it will do it for itself. So if you just leave that system to itself and you just manage the processes and the biology in that system, so you manage the grazers, and the browsers in that system that will release their manures into that system as a source of fertility. They will graze back to prevent that system from transitioning towards a forest. If you create a nice diversity of plants that will all, act as a guild and mutualistically benefit each other and further help create this beneficial soil community. If you just work with the biological processes that are in that system and nurture them and create the environment they want to create and just leave them to do it largely without always coming in and disturbing it all the time, but just supporting it to establish itself, you'll create this abundance within the soil community that will supply the plants with everything they need for free. And that is the way to create this ideal permaculture system that requires less input of resources from us, because most of the inputs we put into an agricultural system is for the growth of the plant through fertility or tillage or weed control or pest control or whatever all these inputs are. We're trying to create this ideal condition for the growth of the plant. But biology will do that for you. If you just work in with the biological processes and if you're aware of how they change over time and stabilize and get more complex over time, just work in with that. You can cut out all that input of resources that you would normally need to put into that system and just work in with that biology. So there's different stages to achieve that. I mean, initially you are moving into that landscape and it's probably quite overgrazed, eroded, the life has really gone out of that soil, and you've got to try to work with that system and the succession of that system to a state which more replicates this stable, diverse woodland system with all these diversity of niche edge habitats that provides the conditions for a superabundant provision of resources. And you want to nurture the transition of that environment that you've inherited towards this stable and diverse and productive environment, which will largely take care of itself through the careful placement and movement of resources around that landscape. And once you get that appreciation of where to place things and how to move elements around that landscape in beneficial ways, you then just become the orchestrator to sustain that environment. You're not doing all the work yourself, but you're just orchestrating the movement of things and the placement of things in beneficial ways, and they do all the work for you. And therefore, the amount of resources and energy you're putting into that system become reduced severely or removed entirely. And at the other end of the system, you're just taking out the beneficial production from that system. And there's lots of benefits to that. I mean, one benefit is that you don't need to, you don't require so much resources from that system, so you can make more provision of habitat and sharing of resources with wildlife and for fair share within your community. You don't need to take everything out of that system for your own consumption, because the production of that system required less input from you. So for the same level of well-being or resources from an agricultural system, if it requires less input into that system, you don't need so much output out of it, which allows you the ability to share more, to work in more with natural systems, which is the ideal of what we want to be able to create in that environment. So, and that only comes from an appreciation of developing this complex biological system.